The war had ended, but the country didn't go back to what it was. It couldn't. Too much had changed. Cities had grown. Land had been fought over. Families had been divided and in many cases lost. The United States survived. But now it had to rebuild. Not just homes, not just towns, but her identity, because this wasn't the same nation that had gone to war. And as it began to move forward again, dogs were there again. Not in the chaos this time, but in the rebuilding.
In the years immediately after the war, life didn't reset. It restarted slowly. In the South, land was damaged. Cities were broken. Systems had collapsed. Rebuilding wasn't a plan. It was survival. In the North, industry continued to grow. Rail lines stretched farther. Towns expanded. Movement began again. And with that movement came routine. Farms were worked again, shops reopened, communities reformed, and dogs returned to their place within it, guarding property, watching over livestock, moving alongside families as they rebuilt what had been lost. Not as symbols, not as something new, but as something familiar, something steady, because after years of disruption, that steadiness mattered. Life wasn't easier, but it was becoming structured again. And dogs fit into that structure the same way they always had. Close to the home, close to work, close to the people who needed them. Because even after everything, that relationship didn't have to be rebuilt. It was already there. As the country rebuilt, it didn't rebuild the same way everywhere. It changed. Railroads stretched across the land, connecting places that had once been isolated. Cities grew. Faster, denser, louder, and the dog had to adapt. The railroad didn't just move people, it moved everything, including dogs. Places that had once been separate were now connected, and dogs that had once stayed local were now traveling with families, with workers, with a country that no longer stood still. And as those lines crossed the land, so did the dogs. Different types meeting, mixing, changing. Not by design, not yet, but enough to matter. In rural areas, life still looked familiar. Dogs lived at the edge of the home, porches, barns, open land. They worked, guarding livestock, hunting when needed, moving freely across space that allowed it. They ate what the household had, scraps, leftovers, whatever could be spared. Sometimes they hunted to supplement it. Life was practical, uncomplicated, but in the cities, things were different. Space was limited. Movement was restricted. Dogs were living closer to people than ever before, not just outside the home, but inside it, sleeping near the hearth, on rugs, at the foot of the bed. Food began to shift too. Still scraps, but more consistent, more tied to routine, because people themselves were living more structured lives. Work hours, schedules, daily patterns. Dogs began to follow those patterns. Care was still basic, but it was improving. More knowledge, more attention. Not formal veterinary medicine as we know it today, but a growing awareness that dogs could be treated and sometimes saved. Collars became more common, still leather, still simple, but more widely used. A sign of ownership, a way to control movement in places where roaming was no longer acceptable. And that mattered because cities didn't tolerate what the frontier once had. Dogs running loose, dogs without clear ownership. Laws followed quickly, licensing, restricting, control, the same pattern, but stronger now because there were more people closer together, and that changed everything. The dog was still working, still useful, but now it was also adapting to something new. Not just land, not just survival, but society. As the country settled into this new rhythm, something else began to change. Not in the land, not in the cities, but in how people saw the dog. For most of American history, a dog was defined by what it could do: hunt, guard, protect, work. Its value was practical, but now that began to shift. People had more structure, more stability, and with that came choice. Dogs were no longer just the result of necessity. They were becoming the result of intention. Certain traits were noticed, selected, repeated: size, temperament, coat, behavior. Dogs that had once simply adapted to their environment were now being shaped by people. And then, in 1884, that change became official. The American Kennel Club was formed, not by one person, but by a group of kennel clubs and breed organizations who saw a problem. Dog shows were growing in popularity, but there were no consistent rules, no shared standards, no agreement on what made a dog what it was. So they created one, a central registry, a system of record, a way to say this dog is this. Early on, that meant organizing the dogs people already knew. Hunting dogs, like pointers, setters, and spaniels. Hounds, like foxhounds and bloodhounds. Working dogs, like mastiffs and Newfoundlands. Terriers, small, fast, relentless hunters of vermin, and smaller companion dogs beginning to appear more frequently in homes. Not new dogs, but newly defined ones, given categories, given standards, written down for the first time. A dog wasn't just described, it was measured. Height, weight, coat, movement, temperament. What had once been flexible became fixed, and with that became something people still recognize today: a registered dog. A dog whose lineage could be traced, whose traits were expected, whose identity was recorded, not just known by its owner, but recognized by a system. That idea that a dog could belong to a defined group with predictable traits and documented history didn't always exist. It started here, and it changed everything, because from that point forward, the dog wasn't just adapting to the world was shaping the dog.
By the time the 1800s came to a close, the country had changed. It was no longer a country defined by a frontier. It was structured, connected, organized, and the dog had changed with it. No longer known by what it just did, but what it was. Defined, recorded, recognized. From the edge of the homestead to the center of the home. From unnamed to registered. From survival to identity. But even with all that change, one thing had it. The dog was still there, still adapting, still staying close, still becoming what people needed it to be. Because no matter how much the world changed, that relationship didn't. Because as this nation moved forward, we didn't leave them behind. Because then, as now, we were a pack. In next week's episode, we talk about two very different dogs. One celebrated for his ride, and the other for the words made famous by his life.
This is America 250, The Dogs. This has been Episode 8.